HOA Karen burns down my hunting lodge and owes $800,000. In a small, peaceful corner of the Appalachian foothills, one man's battle against an overreaching HOA president escalates into a legal and personal war that would forever change his life. This is the story of John Mason, a former military officer and sheriff who found himself up against Karen Henson, the self-proclaimed HOA president with a thirst for control. What began as a simple property dispute soon spiraled into a shocking series of events: arson, fraud, and a fight for justice that would see Karen's once untouchable power crumble before the truth. After Karen intentionally set fire to John's family hunting lodge, a piece of his father's legacy, the battle turned from personal vendetta to a fight for justice. With the weight of fraud and manipulation on her shoulders, Karen found herself facing a staggering $800,000 in damages, all while John Mason set out to rebuild more than just his father's home, but a sense of justice in a community that had been under her thumb for far too long. This isn't just a story of arson and legal retribution. It's a powerful reminder of the lengths some will go to abuse their power and the incredible strength of those who refuse to back down. But what's even more shocking is the truth behind Karen's actions and how far she was willing to go to protect her facade of control. Now, here's the question for you. What do you think of Karen's actions? Do you believe the punishment fit the crime, or was the entire situation an example of how power can be misused in local communities? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And trust me, you won't want to miss the twists and turns in this incredible story. Stay with us until the very end. My name is John Mason, and I am a former soldier. After serving 20 years in the military, I returned to my hometown, a small county nestled within the Appalachian Mountains, to care for my father after he had his first stroke. My hometown is a peaceful place, where winding roads, dense forests, and friendly locals waving at you every morning, even if they don't like you, are commonplace. As someone who has witnessed many changes, both in and outside the military, I learned how to be patient, persistent, and to face challenges calmly. But nothing could compare to the challenge I was about to face when I returned to care for my father and discovered that the greatest legacy he left me wasn't just survival lessons, but a hunting cabin he built with his own hands over the span of 30 years. This cabin was not just an ordinary house. It wasn't merely wood and steel. It was a part of my family's history, where my father taught me everything I needed to know about patience, endurance, and, most importantly, resilience in times of hardship. If viewed from afar, the cabin might seem like a simple wooden structure, but to me, it was a priceless heritage. My father always said it was not just a house, but his church, where he spent years of hard labor, and where I grew up under his loving care. So, when I returned from the military, the cabin was not just a home, but a spiritual anchor, a connection to the past and family, a place that held irreplaceable memories. Everything, from the solid wood beams to the small table where my father often sat reading, carried the marks of a life dedicated to the land and family. And I, just a son, held not only a house in my hands but the entire story of my father, a story that had never been fully told. My life, which seemed peaceful, was soon disrupted by a woman named Karen Henson. She was the president of the HOA, Homeowners Association, in the Sycamore Bluff neighborhood, which was only a few miles away from my home. Little did I know that Karen's arrival would mark the beginning of a long legal battle. Karen, who had just gone through a divorce, began to take control within the community. Perhaps as a way to fill the gap in her personal life, she decided that the HOA wasn't just a management body, but an absolute power that everyone had to follow. Every day, I heard about her through HOA meetings, where she sought to impose strict regulations on every corner of Sycamore Bluff. The problem began when Karen started to take notice of my hunting cabin. Although the cabin was outside the HOA's jurisdiction, it had a small access road leading from her community, and she deemed it a threat to community harmony. She immediately began attempting to enforce the HOA's stringent rules on my land, claiming that what I did on my property affected the so-called aesthetic of the area. I vividly remember the first time Karen appeared at my doorstep. She was holding a long piece of paper, seemingly a copy of the HOA's rules, which she considered the moral code of the entire neighborhood. I was standing outside, amidst the pile of firewood preparing for winter, when I heard the sound of her high heels crunching on the gravel path. Karen's sweet voice rang out. "Hello, I'm Karen Henson, the president of the Sycamore Bluff HOA. I think we need to talk about your house." I looked up, wiped my hands on the rag, and looked at her. "Could you clarify? My house is mine. It has nothing to do with the HOA. Karen was unfazed. She pulled a paper from her bag and held it up as if it were a court order. "But according to HOA regulations, I think we need to discuss the harmony of the neighborhood. Your house doesn't seem to fit the style of Sycamore Bluff." I raised an eyebrow, slightly annoyed. "The style of Sycamore Bluff? Are you talking about this house or the pile of firewood I left outside? Do you even know where this is? This is my land, and I've lived here since 1952. Your HOA has no jurisdiction here." Karen smiled, but it was the smile of someone who believed she had absolute power. "You may think that, but because your house is near the HOA area, it affects the overall harmony. And I think we can find a way to improve things, like replacing the untreated wood and covering up the firewood." I looked at her, trying to stay calm. "Didn't you hear me? This land doesn't belong to the HOA, and I'm under no obligation to follow such unreasonable demands. You can't just go around forcing others to follow rules they don't agree with." Karen looked at me with a slightly mocking expression. "You don't have to, but you might find it at least a little necessary to improve the overall image of the area. I'll send you a copy of the regulations and hope you'll cooperate." After the first meeting with Karen, I thought she would realize that not everyone could be easily bullied by the HOA's unreasonable rules. But I was wrong. That was just the beginning of a battle she intended to drag on. In the following days, I received numerous letters from the HOA, all of them fines for reasons I never thought were possible. Each fine was a punch to my patience. Once, I received a notice claiming that the firewood I had left outside was an unsightly object, even though it was just a regular pile of firewood I was using to prepare for winter. Another time, I received a fine for a drainage system not meeting HOA standards, even though that drainage system had been in place long before the HOA existed. Honestly, I began to feel like a criminal just for living in a hunting cabin on my family's land. Then, the next blows didn't just stop at sending fines. Karen kept posting fake signs along the roads leading to my property. Each sign said, "HOA area for residents only," clearly an illegal attempt to seize control. I didn't just remove these signs once, but twice, throwing them into the fire. Yet the very next night, they would appear again, as though an HOA army had secretly installed them when I wasn't looking. Just when I was considering reporting the matter to local authorities, I discovered something that made everything even more serious. One morning, as I was walking around the land to check the situation, I noticed strange traces along the stream near the house. When I got closer, I could hardly believe my eyes. A pile of construction waste, from mortar, broken bricks, to old cement bags, was scattered in the stream, blocking the flow of water. This was a clear act of illegal dumping and environmental pollution. This was not only a violation of environmental protection laws, but also a deliberate attempt to damage my land. I stood there, staring at the trash for a long time, my anger boiling inside. Without needing much thought, I realized who was behind all of this. Karen had gone too far, not just hurting me legally, but also directly harming the environment around me, the place where I grew up and witnessed the beauty of nature. One afternoon, when I returned home after a day of work, I noticed that the electricity in the house had been cut off. Standing in front of the electric meter, I realized it wasn't due to a natural disaster or any technical malfunction, but because of a request from Karen herself. I called the electric company, and the person in charge told me that the HOA had made a request stating that this house is unsafe and uninhabited, even though my father and I still live there. I provided proof of land ownership and requested the power be restored immediately, but I had to wait a long time and send more documentation to verify ownership. She didn't stop there. At this point, I realized that this wasn't just a small dispute anymore. It was a campaign aimed at forcing me off my land, by any means necessary. But I wasn't rushing to react. As my father taught me, patience is the greatest strength. I didn't engage in arguments or act impulsively. Instead, I began collecting evidence. I kept track of every letter she sent, every fake sign she put up, and every illegal act she committed. I installed security cameras around my property to capture every move of the HOA and Karen, and I kept all documents that could prove she was abusing her power. She thought I would give up, but I decided not to let things pass easily. I wanted to prove that no one, even the head of the HOA, could act as if they owned everything around them. And I started preparing for the next legal battle, a battle I would not only win, but also make her pay for what she had done. After Karen's constant infringements, I began to feel like I was standing on the edge of a war with no turning back. But nothing could have prepared me for the next insane act she would commit. It was a wedding she decided to hold right on my land, without asking for permission. One morning, I woke up to see a major change. Along the road leading to my house, where I always saw lush grass and ferns growing around, now stood a huge wedding tent, with white columns and silken drapes fluttering in the wind. I stood there, staring in disbelief at what I was seeing. A crowd had gathered, preparing for an extravagant wedding, all happening right on the land my family had cared for over the years. No one had informed me in advance, not a word of permission, nor even a casual conversation about holding this event. It was my land, the land my father had left to me, and I was never asked if it could be used for any event, let alone setting up such a grand stage. I felt anger rising within me. This was not just an infringement on my property rights, but a blatant insult to me and the effort I had put into protecting this land. As I got closer, I encountered her, Karen, standing among the crowd, commanding like a queen. She smiled when she saw me approach, but that smile only made me angrier. "Hello, John. I just thought your land was beautiful and perfect for a wedding. I asked the organizers to set up the tent. This is my niece's wedding, and I thought it would be wonderful to have it here. After all, this is near the HOA area, so it's fine," Karen said in a tone that was as if she was talking about something trivial. I couldn't believe my ears. "What have you done on my land without asking? Do you think just because it's near the HOA area, you can violate my property rights?" I responded, trying to keep my tone calm, but clearly unable to hide my anger. Karen just smiled, showing no sign of apology or regret. "I just thought you wouldn't mind. This wedding could help raise the value of the area, and maybe we can make everything look nicer." My eyes narrowed. She truly didn't know where the line was. It was time for me to act. I didn't do anything immediately, but I knew I couldn't let her continue infringing on my rights like this. This house wasn't a playground for those who wanted to break the rules. Karen's actions had not only invaded my living space, but also threatened my crops, as she set up the wedding tent right on the soybean field I had cared for all season. As the wedding preparations were reaching their most intense stage, I decided to use a method that would certainly make everyone remember. I went into the garage, where I kept my John Deere fertilizer spreader. This was the tool I used to care for the land, but today, I would use it for a different purpose. I carefully drove the spreader out, aiming it toward the wedding tent. The wedding organizers were bustling around, unaware that a manure storm was about to hit. I flipped the switch, and in an instant, streams of cow manure sprayed everywhere, shattering the perfection they had been building. The wedding turned into chaos immediately. Guests scattered in all directions, some frantically trying to protect their outfits from getting dirty, while the wedding organizers stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. Laughter, screams, and curses filled the air, but I just stood there, watching them. This spectacle was my revenge for what Karen had done. She wanted to turn my land into a wedding venue without asking me. Now, I would make sure she would never forget. With a smug smile, I turned and walked away, without a word of apology. The wedding was canceled, and I had sent a clear message to Karen. Never think you can infringe upon what belongs to me without paying the price. Things seemed to have reached the highest point of tension, but I never expected that Karen's invasion would reach a horrific climax like this. My father's house, the precious legacy I had protected for years, was engulfed in a massive fire, and I immediately felt that this wasn't just an ordinary accident. When I returned home after a short business trip, I saw thick black smoke rising from my house. The first feeling was panic, followed by despair. The house my father had painstakingly built over 30 years, the church he had always regarded as sacred, was burning fiercely. Everything, from the wooden beams he had carefully selected to the small table where he sat each night, was now reduced to ash. When the fire department arrived, the flames had spread too quickly, and all that was left were the remnants of a great handcrafted work. My heart ached, but the despair began to transform into something else, a feeling I couldn't deny. Doubt. This was not an accident. What made me suspicious from the start was how fast the fire spread. There were no signs of a natural fire, like a lightning strike or a strong wind carrying flames from elsewhere. I remembered the house inspection before I left. It had been safe, with nothing unusual. There had been small signs before, strange actions I hadn't noticed, like odd traces around the land, unclear footsteps, and footprints in the mud behind the house. What made me more certain was that recently, Karen had become too obvious in her actions. She no longer acted covertly, but openly posted fake signs near my land. And now my house was burned down. It couldn't just be a coincidence. I decided I had to get to the bottom of it, and I couldn't trust local authorities without solid evidence. I began reviewing the security cameras I had installed around my land from previous incidents when she had started acting strangely. After hours of reviewing, I finally found what I needed. The images from the security cameras left no doubt. I saw Karen, dressed in camouflage, sneaking around the land in the late afternoon, carrying a red gasoline can. She looked around cautiously, as if fearing someone would see her, before she poured the gasoline around my house. I watched as she set it on fire and quickly ran away as the flames started to spread, growing larger with each passing minute. What I had suspected all along now became undeniable truth. Karen had set my house on fire. After collecting the footage from the security cameras and clear evidence that Karen was responsible for burning my house down, I realized I couldn't act rashly. This wasn't just a regular battle. This was a fight for survival, and I couldn't let my emotions control me. I needed to be sure, gather all the legal evidence, and build an undeniable case. What I did first was be patient. I didn't rush to report to the police or make the matter public immediately. I knew that in order to defeat Karen and extinguish her power, I needed solid evidence, not just from her actions against me, but also from others she had harassed before. I started looking for local residents who had been wronged by Karen. Every threat, every unreasonable fine she had imposed on them, all were important pieces of this case. I began reaching out to residents, especially those who had no way to fight back against her, and listen to their stories. There was an elderly woman named Miss Lorna, who lived in a modest house not far from my land. She told me about how Karen had threatened her over a very silly reason. Miss Lorna had a bird bath in her garden, something Karen considered a serious violation of HOA rules. Karen demanded she dismantle the bird bath and fine her a large amount, even though it was just a simple decoration Miss Lorna had enjoyed for years. I didn't dare oppose her. She told me I could be sued if I didn't comply, Miss Lorna said, her eyes darting nervously at me. It wasn't just Miss Lorna. I also heard the story of Bill, an elderly man who had lived in the area since he was a young boy. Karen fined Bill for using Christmas lights that didn't meet the HOA standards. What was strange was that he was Jewish and used a menorah instead of a Christmas tree. Karen didn't care about Bill's beliefs, only focusing on fining him for not adhering to the community's aesthetic rules. The stories from these people not only made me furious, but also made me realize something important. Karen wasn't just an abuser of power. She was a manipulator, creating a fake HOA with the goal of controlling people and profiting from it. And I started to see a troubling connection. After a few conversations and digging deeper, I discovered that Karen had used sophisticated fraudulent methods to build a completely fake HOA. She had gathered signatures from people who had no idea they were joining the HOA or from those who signed unintentionally. She even forged letters from the HOA board to intimidate residents in the area. Everything she did had no legal value. That meant every fine, all of her demands, were illegal. Not only that, I discovered that she had been using tactics to isolate weaker residents in the area, especially the elderly or those unable to fight back. Some people were threatened with paying unreasonable fines, while others were pressured to withdraw from the HOA community without any legitimate reason. The evidence was becoming clearer and clearer, and everything was falling into place just as I needed. But I knew that gathering evidence was only the first step. I needed to piece all these pieces together to build an irrefutable case and bring Karen to justice. The so-called HOA that Karen had set up was not only a scam, but also an attempt to exploit power illegally. And now, I was ready to take her to court. The day of the trial finally arrived, and I stood there in the courtroom, alongside witnesses, my lawyer, and all the residents who had been abused by Karen's power over the years. The tension in the air was palpable, but I knew everything had been prepared meticulously, and there was no turning back. Karen entered the courtroom, calm and composed, her face showing no emotion. She wore a gray business suit, holding an expensive handbag, and walked confidently, seemingly unaware of her guilt. She glanced around, and I saw a look of arrogance in her eyes, as if she had already won the battle. But I knew this day would be different, and it wouldn't go as she had manipulated in the past. As soon as the trial began, Karen stood up, introduced herself to the court, and began to justify her actions. Her voice was soft but persuasive, as if she were giving a legal lecture. "Your Honor," Karen began, "the fire was an unfortunate accident. Mr. Mason's house caught fire due to an unforeseeable incident. I had no intention of harming him or destroying his property. It was a sudden mishap, and no one wanted this to happen." The courtroom fell silent, and I felt tense hearing her absurd justifications. But I couldn't let her persuade anyone here. Once Karen finished her defense, my lawyer stood up, holding a thick file, and began presenting the evidence. I looked over and saw that the entire process of gathering evidence had been organized in a systematic way. The video footage from security cameras, photos of gasoline traces on the land, and documents detailing Karen's actions in creating a fake HOA were all clearly displayed on a large screen in front of the court. My lawyer pointed to the screen and said, "Your Honor, this is a video from Mr. Mason's surveillance camera. In the video, we can clearly see Mrs. Karen Henson, dressed in camouflage, carrying a gasoline can and walking around Mr. Mason's house. She then sets it on fire, causing the house to burn." The courtroom was silent. No one dared to breathe. Karen sat still, her face changing from confidence to tension. Next, the witnesses began to testify. First was Miss Lorna, an elderly woman who had been threatened by Karen because of the birdbath in her garden. Miss Lorna stood before the court, trembling a little but then recounting in detail how Karen had forced her to remove the birdbath and pay a ridiculous fine for violating HOA rules. "She told me that if I didn't comply, I would be sued," Miss Lorna said, her voice choking with emotion. "I didn't have money to fight her, but I had to comply because I was afraid of getting fined again." Next came Bill, an elderly man, explaining how Karen fined him for using a menorah during Hanukkah. Bill explained that, as a Jew, the menorah was a family tradition, but Karen told him that using a menorah didn't meet HOA standards. "She didn't care about my beliefs. She just wanted me to take it down and pay a fine for the so-called violation of aesthetic standards," Bill said with anger in his voice. Each of their testimonies clarified that Karen was not just someone forcing residents to follow unreasonable rules, but someone using her power to exploit and manipulate the community. When the final verdict was given, the tension in the courtroom was released. Karen, once confident like a queen, now had no way out. The judge recognized all the charges she was responsible for: arson, fraud, and abuse of power. All the evidence I had gathered led to an undeniable conclusion. Karen could not justify her actions of setting my house on fire, creating a fake HOA, or oppressing the residents in the area. Defendant Karen Henson, the judge declared in a stern voice, will be held accountable for her criminal actions. The defendant is convicted of arson, fraud, and abuse of power. The defendant will be required to pay restitution amounting to over $800,000, including repair costs for Mr. Mason's house and damages caused by the defendant's illegal acts. Additionally, the defendant will be required to perform community service for 3 years and serve a 5-year probation period. The courtroom was silent after the judge's ruling. Karen said nothing, standing there with empty eyes, as if unable to believe that everything had ended this way. Those who had been following the trial from outside the courtroom, the victims of her actions, couldn't hide their emotions. Part of me felt relieved, but another part, the part that had fought through all of this, just wanted to see her acknowledge the wrongness of her actions. And then, the most miraculous thing happened. Karen lost everything, not just because of the massive restitution, but because of the destruction of the reputation and power she had built. The lavish house she had once been so proud of was now seized, and no one wanted to live in a house that had been taken over by such a greedy and tyrannical person. No one wanted to be associated with her, and her community was now full of people mocking her downfall. She had to sell her house to pay off the debts, and not long after, there were reports that it had been heavily discounted. No one was coming to view the house anymore, and rumors of the fake HOA and Karen's frauds spread quickly throughout the community. After all the tension and conflict, the community where I lived, those who had suffered under Karen's harassment and oppression, could finally breathe a sigh of relief. We had won, and that victory wasn't just for me, but for everyone who had been exploited by her over the years. That day, when the verdict was given, the community decided to host a barbecue to celebrate the victory and the restoration of peace in the area. The party took place in the park near my house, where Karen had once tried to seize control. Families gathered, grilled meat, chatted, and laughed. Children ran around, no longer worried about ridiculous fines or the boycotts from a fake HOA. I stood there, looking around and feeling the relaxed atmosphere, the sense of peace that I had lost throughout this confrontation. Finally, we had regained our freedom, and not just me, but the entire community felt like they had just finished a long and stressful battle. We had won, not just for one individual, but for all those who had been oppressed, who had endured the tyrannical control of a greedy person. After everything that had happened, after months of facing Karen's greed and abuse of power, I stood before an undeniable truth. My father's hunting cabin, although it had been burned down, still carried the powerful legacy and invaluable spirit that I would never let go of. This wasn't just a house. It was the soul of my family, a symbol of everything my father had built with his own hands over 30 years. But the battle was over, and I decided that now was the time to start over. Not just repairing, but rebuilding this house stronger and more resilient. I wouldn't just fix the burnt parts. I would upgrade the house with modern and safe materials. I installed fire-resistant materials to help the house withstand any future threats. Solar panels were placed on the roof, not only to save on costs, but to show a commitment to a sustainable future, subtly modernizing the living space. But the special thing I wanted to do was carve a new nameplate for the house, a symbol of victory and perseverance. I drew inspiration from the events that had passed and from everything I had learned throughout this struggle. On the plaque, I engraved the words, "Karen Proof since 2024. It wasn't just a statement of resilience, but also an affirmation that people like Karen could not change what had been built with hard work and love. Even though Karen continued to try to fight me, filing appeals, and even sending desperate letters to authorities, the battle was over. She no longer had power, no longer had the support of the fake HOA she had created, and had no tools left to influence me or the community. She lost everything, from her house, her reputation, to every bit of power she once had. Part of me felt relieved to see her face the consequences of her greed and cruelty. However, another part of me also understood that Karen's defeat wasn't just the result of the wrong she had done, but also a cautionary lesson for others. People like Karen, those who abuse power to control others, need to realize that no one can hold on to power when it's built on injustice and the violation of others' rights. My community, those who had endured Karen's oppression, could now live in peace. No more ridiculous fines, no more threats from fake signs, no more boycotts. Everyone felt more secure, and life returned to its normal rhythm. When the hunting cabin was completed, I invited friends and neighbors to come see it. The celebration wasn't just to mark the revival of the house, but also to celebrate the triumph of justice. Everyone was laughing and talking happily, and there was a sense of relief in the air, as if the burdens that had weighed on us for so long had finally been lifted. I stood in the yard, looking at the house that had now been restored to its beauty, but with a new, solid, and modern appearance. And I knew that, no matter what Karen continued to do, I would never let the invasion and abuse of power break what had been built with love and respect. This was a new beginning, not just for me, but for the entire community. A new chapter in my life, with the hunting cabin not only being the place where my family and I lived, but also a testament to perseverance and the strength of justice. As the dust settles and Karen's empire of manipulation crumbles, the story of John Mason proves that justice can prevail, no matter how powerful the opponent. From the ashes of his father's hunting lodge, John rebuilt not only a home, but the trust of a community long overshadowed by Karen's iron grip. The $800,000 penalty and the loss of everything she once controlled were only the beginning of the consequences she faced for her actions. This tale reminds us all that, No matter the odds, standing up for what's right can lead to a victory greater than we ever imagined. What do you think? Did Karen get what she deserved? Or was there another way this could have played out? Share your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another shocking HOA story from the HOA Karen files. Thanks for watching. See you in the next episode.